All right, so continuing in here, now we're going to work on identifying our null and alternative hypotheses in terms of how they also apply to a left-tailed, right-tailed, or two-tailed test. Okay, and so on these problems, we're going to sketch our normal distribution, and we're going to shade in the area of our p-value after, right, we are going to identify. We're going to state our HO and HA. We're also going to clarify which one is our claim, and that will also then help us to then sketch this and shade in our p-value. All right, so first one here, number 9. A school publicized that the proportion of its students who are involved in at least one extracurricular activity is 61%. So remember that is equals, okay, so we have our HO and our HA. So is 61 is that. And so then our alternative hypothesis is not 0.61. All right, this is our claim. This is what they're claiming to be true. And now, since we are not equals, this is a two-tailed test. Zero because we've normalized it, and two-tailed test. And remember that this is 1/2 of p, and this is also 1/2 of our p-value. All right, 10. So a car dealership announces that the mean time for an oil change is less than 15 minutes. So we have our HO, our HA, and our cut point is 15 is what we're looking at. And so we want less than. So less than goes on alternative because our null hypothesis is always equal to, less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to. And so with that, then our null hypothesis is going to be greater than or equal to 15, making our claim down here at our alternative hypothesis. And since it is a less than, right, we're going to be going to the left. It is a left-tailed test. And so let's label that left-tailed right there, and then that is our p-value. All right, let's look at 11. So we have a company that advertises the mean life of its furnaces is more than 18 years. So we have HO, HA, our cut point is 18. And we are more than, so that means our P is more than, and then our null hypothesis is going to be our less than or equal to. Our claim is more than, so that's our alternative. And since we are more than, we're going to the right, meaning we have a right-tailed test. And these don't have to be perfect sketches, but enough to see what we're doing. And then our right-tailed, so our shaded side, that is our p-value. And then there's a p-value video If you needed more explanation, this is a pretty good video to get a little extra help. All right, so let's look now how we make decisions based off of this. So in order to use our p-value to make a decision in a hypothesis test, we want to compare the p-value with our alpha. And so the big things is if the p-value is less than alpha, we're going to reject our null hypothesis. But if our p-value is greater than our alpha, we then are going to fail to reject our null hypothesis. And so as we look at kind of our two-way table of our decisions and claims, all right, so if our claim of our null hypothesis and there's enough evidence to reject the claim, we can reject our null hypothesis. If the claim is the alternative hypothesis and there's enough evidence to support the claim, we also reject the null hypothesis, because in this case, right, we are supporting HA. So if we're going to support our alternative hypothesis, we then have to reject the null. All right, and so we got to pay attention to where the claim is in all of these. So let's look at a couple examples. So you perform a hypothesis test for each claim. You perform a hypothesis test for each claim. How should you interpret your decision if you reject the null hypothesis? What if you fail to reject the null hypothesis? So on 12, our null hypothesis, which is our claim. So a school publicizes that the proportion of its students who are involved in at least one extracurricular activity is 61%. Okay, so we've seen that in a previous problem. And so conclusion 1. So if we reject the null hypothesis, then there is enough evidence to reject the claim. And remember, our claim was that is 61%. That there is 61% of students in at least one extracurricular activity. Now, this could go either way, because if we go back to here, it's a two-tailed, right? And so they're claiming a specific value. So the proportion could be actually greater than or less than. That's why it's the two-tailed test. Okay? We're not going to figure that out right now. We're just saying, hey, there is evidence to reject this claim. And so therefore, we're going to reject our null hypothesis. All right, now on the flip, conclusion 2, if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, that tells us there is not enough evidence to reject the claim that there is ... 61% of students in at least one extracurricular activity. Now, this doesn't mean that there is 61%. It just means that we do not have enough evidence to reject that claim. Again, we don't say something is true. We either reject the claim, in this case our null hypothesis, or we fail to reject the claim, which in this case would be the null hypothesis. All right, let's look at another example. Same process. Looking at our car dealership example, where the mean time for an oil change is less than 15 minutes. So our claim this time, all right, is our alternative hypothesis. And so then are we rejecting the null or fail to reject based on what we have on our claim, which again is the alternative hypothesis. So pay attention to that. All right, so first conclusion. We reject our null hypothesis. What we're saying this time is there is enough evidence to support the claim. Because remember, this time our claim is RHA, so if there's enough evidence for the alternative hypothesis, that would then make the null hypothesis rejected. And our claim is that the mean time for an oil change is less than 15 minutes. Okay, so notice again that we reject our null hypothesis because there is enough evidence to support the claim, and that is because our claim this time is for our alternative hypothesis. All right, second conclusion. So this time, if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, there is not enough evidence to support the claim. So this time there's not enough evidence to support the alternative hypothesis, so therefore we're going to fail to reject our null hypothesis. That the mean time for an oil change is less than 15 minutes. All right, so we have some steps here in a nice clean table format for you to kind of reference. Step one, we've been doing a bunch here. In this section is state the claim mathematically and verbally, identifying the null and alternative hypothesis. Then we want to specify the level of significance. So our alpha is at 10, 5, 1. All right, so what's our level of significance, which we'll dive into deeper later. We want to determine the standardized sampling distribution in Sketch's graph. We've done some of that before. Then we'll calculate our test, okay, and its corresponding standardized test statistic. We're going to add that to the sketch. We can then find our p-value. We're going to use this decision rule. Okay, yes or no, do we fail to reject or reject the null hypothesis? And then we write a statement. Okay, so we've done bits of these as we work through chapter 7. We'll end up filling in the rest of these statements. All right, a couple strategies here. Strategies that you will use in hypothesis testing should depend on whether you're trying to support or reject a claim. Hey, you cannot use a hypothesis test to support your claim when your claim is the null hypothesis. All right, so as a researcher, what we want to do is we want to perform a hypothesis test where the possible outcome will support the claim. So what we'll do is we'll word the claim so it is the alternative hypothesis. And then if we want to perform a hypothesis test where the possible outcome will reject a claim, word it so the claim is the null hypothesis. So let's look at an example here. So how would you write the null and alternative hypothesis when you are on the research team and want to support the claim? How would you interpret a decision that rejects the null hypothesis? So our context is a medical research team is investigating the benefits of a new surgical treatment. One of the claims is the main recovery time for patients after the new treatment is less than 96 hours. And so our null hypothesis, so they want less than 96. So then our null is going to be greater than 96. And our alternative is less than 96. And we want our claim to be the alternative. Because how would you write the null and alternative when you're a research team and you want to support the claim? And so when we want to support the claim, we want our alternative hypothesis. And so if we reject our null, then there is enough evidence to support the claim, which is our alternative hypothesis, which is what we want. The mean recovery time is less than 96 hours. All right, let's look at one more. So how would you write the null and alternative hypothesis when you're on an opposing team and want to reject the claim? How should you interpret a decision that rejects the null hypothesis? So this time, we still have our HO. P is going to be less than or equal to 96. Our HA. P is going to be greater than 96. And this is our claim, because we want to reject that claim. And so we, based on what we're seeing, is that it's less than 96. So we're going to write it so that our null hypothesis is the claim. And then what we get from this is if we reject our null hypothesis, then there is not enough evidence to support the claim. That the mean recovery time is less than 96 hours. All right, so in 16, if in the previous example we wrote the hypotheses so we would have possibility of rejecting the claim of the other side, why would we want to reject a claim rather than fail to reject a claim? And the reason we want to reject a claim is because over failing to reject a claim is there is more evidence when you reject a claim versus when you fail to reject. And the reason is when we fail to reject, it doesn't prove that the other is true. It doesn't prove that the claim is true. We just don't have enough evidence to reject it, and so we fail to reject it. But when we reject a claim, there is evidence supporting that side of it. Okay? And then here's our big thing again of how you want nice table, clean, study this idea. Okay? Mental picture it, rewrite it if you need to, but this will help all your decision making.